Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My name is Amy Draves, and I'm pleased to welcome Jay Nichols to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Jay's here to discuss his book, Blue Mind, the surprising science that shows how being near, in, on, or underwater can make you happier, healthier, more connected, and better at what you do. His research and expeditions have taken him to coasts and waterways across the planet, where he continually finds that emotional connection to waters of all kinds is what keeps people working hard to understand and restore our planet. Jay is a research associate at California Academy of Sciences and co-founder of several organizations devoted to advocacy and conservation. They include Ocean Revolution, See the Wild, and Live Blue. He's authored or co-authored more than 50 scientific books or papers, and his work has been featured in numerous media outlets and magazines, including NPR, BBC, National Geographic, Time, Newsweek, and GQ. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you. How's everybody doing? Good? I want to make sure that everybody who has come in has gotten one of these. Or I guess the better way to ask that question is, anybody not have one of these blue marbles? So, nice work on passing those out. So what I want to do, this is the first adult book that I've written. My previous book was a kid's book. And so this is the first book tour that I've done for adults. So doing a book tour for kids is very different. You pull the chairs in a circle and you read the story about the sea turtles together, and it's quite intimate and fun and unpredictable. But this is a little bit different. So I'm learning about book talks, and I've decided to make every single book talk I do on this book tour different from the others in some way. And I call it my deconstructed book tour. And so the way I want to start out today is, if you've got your blue marble, take it out. And look around and find somebody that you didn't walk into the room with, that you're not sitting with on purpose, maybe that you don't know so well. And pair up or get into a group of 3, because sometimes the numbers are a little bit off. And what I want you to do is just trade your blue marbles with that person. Make sure you know their name. And I want you to answer a very simple question. Tell them where you fell in love with water. What's your water? What was that place, whether it was a lake or a river or a swimming pool or maybe an ocean, maybe a blow-up pool, maybe a puddle, who knows? But go back, dig back into your earlier years, or maybe it's more recent, and just describe that place and what it was like, how it felt, who you were with, and what it may mean to you. And then we'll take about 5 minutes, and then we'll get back together and continue the conversation. So over to you guys, go for it, and I'll let you know when your 5 minutes is up. You too. You can talk to each other. It's all right.
Actually, my father-in-law lived in a place like Hawaii. We were just doing this last night. And I mean, I remember talking to she was saying how relaxed it was. And I mean, I was like, man, when I show up there, it's like, doesn't matter what's going on, and we talk about kids and all that stuff. We hit the beach, and I'm like, planted in the sand and just sitting there, and you know, can get lost for hours. It seems like, you know, that's one place that just happens. So when it's the topic of this thing, I was like, oh man, I gotta go learn more about
All right, if you have not heard the other person's story, please make sure you have and wrap up your conversation a little bit there, and we'll focus back on Blue Mind. So I'm going to ask you if, not to tell your own story, but if anybody listened to an intriguing or interesting story. I'm sure there were quite a few, but just want to ask a couple of people if they would like to share a short version, a summary of what they just heard. Yeah.
Sure. I'm Brian, and I spoke with Kate just now. And one thing actually we both shared was we both grew up on the coast, Kate from nearby Boston, and the point where she realized that she fell in love with the water was when they visited Tennessee, I believe it was, and realized that there was no ocean nearby, and started getting claustrophobic when all they had was a brown river going through the middle of town, and just where's the water was the kind of the overwhelming thought and feeling.
Nice, very good. Another story, or another insight from this side. And there's someone itching to speak. And I'll call on you if you don't raise your hand.
I talked to Bosco, and he lived in Hawaii for about 10 years, he said, some time ago, and he has two favorite places there. One is Sunset Beach, where you can see the sunset every day. The second was Turtle Bay, right? Mm-hmm. Turtle Bay, which seems also to be a nice place, and which was where he had his first date with his wife.
Oh, nice. Very nice. So I think one of the common things is you ask that simple question, and everybody's got an answer to it. Everybody can find something in their background, something in their childhood, or even their recent history that connects them and their life story to water in some way. And it may be in Tennessee, it may be in Hawaii, it may be in Boston, maybe here and around the Sound. For me, when I think of that question, I think of my dad, and it's more of a series of waters, but always, from a very young age, always with him. And that's sort of a very personal and poignant thing to share right now, because right now he's in the hospital, hanging on. I think he's going to be all right. But we talk every day, and I say, Dad, when you get out, we're going to swim. We're going to go for a swim. We're going to go to a lake. We're going to go to the ocean, and we're going to swim together. And my earliest memories that I maybe remember from photographs even are my dad holding me in the ocean. And I can, And when I think of that, and I just think of that photograph right now, I can feel his back. I can feel his shoulders. I can feel what it feels like to hang on to someone you love in the water. And those are great memories, and they're so much a part of being a kid, and then being in the water together as adults. And then as his health fails, that water still being a thing in our lives together that heals both of us. And jumping forward, my daughter, I have two daughters, one is 9 and one is 12. Julia, younger daughter, came home from kindergarten. And by the way, I told this story recently, and she corrected me. I said it was first grade. And then afterwards, she pulled me aside and she said, "Dad, good story, but it was kindergarten." She was learning to write and had written her first sentence, her first full sentence. And she came home from school and handed me this scrap of paper. And it said, "My favorite thing to do is swim with my dad." And she handed me that piece of paper, and I read it. And she had written it with help. It was quite an accomplishment. But her first sentence was that same sentiment that I would have said that myself at her age, and I would have written that, and I probably even did write that in kindergarten. And so as a marine biologist, my background, I fell in love with the water at an early age, and somehow fell in love with turtles at a slightly later age, catching snapping turtles in the Chesapeake Bay and releasing them as a kid, and then sometimes recapturing them and painting numbers on their shells and letting them go, and then sometimes catching a few turtles with numbers painted on their shells, and then just in a pure sense of play, I was also kind of a math geek. So we would do basic algebra to try to figure out how many sea turtles were in this branch of the Chesapeake Bay. So basic mark recapture statistics, though we didn't call it that. It was a game for us. But I would stay awake at night trying to figure out different ways, not only to catch the turtles and tag them with paint, but also to calculate the population size and just very rudimentary early math turtle geekiness at about 12 years of age. And then later found myself going into marine biology and following that passion and going to grad school and studying economics and studying ecology for a doctorate and studying sea turtles and putting it all together and getting involved in tracking sea turtles around the ocean, doing genetic research. Basically, we learned everything you might want to ask about that population of sea turtles off the Pacific coast of Baja. What they eat, how they digest it, how far they swim, how long they live, how fast they grow, their migratory routes, so on and so forth. Piles of research. But the thing that I realized was that pile of science was getting bigger. My CV was getting longer. Our team was winning awards and getting involved in higher levels of professional societies. But that science wasn't saving sea turtles. It didn't just translate to action because the regulatory agencies were not just sitting there waiting for science and ready to act with adequate funding. They just was kind of non-existent. And I realized that in order to do what I thought I was there to do, which was to make sure these animals didn't go extinct, I needed a whole different set of skills that involved communication with people who didn't look like me, who didn't have the same backgrounds as I did, who made a living hunting sea turtles and selling their meat, who grew up eating sea turtles and living in coastal communities, and who also had an appreciation for and a love of the ocean, who grew up swimming in the ocean and climbing on their parents' shoulders, but thought about sea turtles in a very different way. And that led me to start to communicate with people outside of my department. And I think you probably can relate to that here. As you try to solve new problems, sometimes you need to go knock on a door of a different building. Sometimes it's not even an adjacent building, and talk to people in different departments with vastly different skill sets. And what I realized is the departments I needed to talk to were folks in geography, anthropology, sociology, not just evolutionary biology and ecology, but even more afield, people in the cognitive sciences, neuropsychologists, because the emotional drivers of the problems we were trying to solve and the emotional drivers of the solutions to those problems were probably best understood in a technical sense by people who study the human brain. And so that made logical sense to me, but my committee in graduate school, my doctoral committee, basically rolled their eyes at that idea. They said, don't go there, son. That is career suicide. You're talking crazy talk. Just stick to turtle ecology, publish your papers. You've got a nice career ahead. You can be a turtle biologist. Our job is to keep you within the lines. Just keep doing that stuff. Get your peer-reviewed publications out, and everything will be okay. But I had this idea that it wouldn't be okay unless we started reaching kind of across the aisle or across the campus and pulling disciplines together. And so that's kind of the early lead up to this project that I now call Blue Mind. And I started to hang out with neuroscientists and ask them what they thought about the ocean, what they thought about water. What did they think it was that compelled people to feel these feelings that we just discussed? And maybe water was no different than, say, a dry erase board on the wall. Or maybe swimming in the ocean was no different than, say, bowling with your parents. Maybe there's nothing special about it, but what was special was the interaction with those you love. So as I started to dig into it, I realized that it seemed that there's something about water that is different than bowling or different than a painting on the wall. There's something about having that watery experience that changes our brain, changes our physiology in a unique way. And as we started to get neuroscientists together and have these Blue Mind summits, as we called them, and started to connect the dots, a story emerged that has become this book. And I remember having the feeling that I was completely unprepared to be the convener of this conversation. I was certainly not the guy to write this book. I had a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, not cognitive science, not neuroscience. I was trying to get quickly up to speed and attend neuroscience conferences and listen to neuroscience lectures recorded while swimming laps. In fact, I've listened to MIT neuroscience lectures underwater while swimming laps. This is the way I took neuroscience courses. And for 2 years, I tried very hard to give this project away. I was convinced that this was not really something that I would be doing myself, and that there were other people that should probably be the ones who would better take this forward. And so let me read a little passage. So as a non-neuroscientist, I composed a rather good proposal about Blue Mind and submitted it to the foundation. In this case, the foundation was Pew Charitable Trust. And I'd been nominated for a fellowship. The first time I was nominated for that fellowship, I wrote a proposal about sea turtles, and I'd been denied it because I was, quote unquote, too young. This time, the second time I was nominated, the response was, quote unquote, too creative. So too young and too creative, not so bad, right? But unfunded. Despite these setbacks, both projects have moved forward, and I've greatly enjoyed the many collaborations and contributions that have come from them. Now I'm neither too young nor too creative, but I am patient, persistent, and truly enamored. I love water. I love the ocean, and that's kind of the driver of the whole thing. This book is the result of that mix, a life driven by a love of water, some patience and persistence, and a lot of collaboration and conversation with fellow water lovers and scientists, a truly excellent group of people. So the initial part of this project was to really try to give it away to someone better prepared, smarter, with a different skill set more appropriate for this project. And I was unsuccessful at doing that. But as we started to bring people together and connect the dots, what we found were two things. The neuroscientists, leading neuroscientists that were invited to the Blue Mind Summits, all said, when they were first invited in this phone call, they all said, I think you've got the wrong person. I don't study the brain on water. I don't study the brain on oceans. I don't study the brain on blue. I don't think I'm the right person to come to this conference. And then a little bit later in the conversation, they would say, I really want to be at that conference. I really want to be in the room. I understand, and I think I can contribute, even though the research right on top of the question was non-existent. We started to place dots all around our dot. And then we started to connect those dots. And the way we would do that was we would take a water practitioner, somebody perhaps with the last name Cousteau, or a big wave surfer like Jeff Clark, who surfed Mavericks by himself for 10 years, or an adventurer, a river guide, somebody who spent their life in, on, or underwater. And we'd pair them up with a neuroscientist, and we give them a new question that neither of them had thought about. So in the case of Jeff Clark, the guy exudes ocean. He exudes confidence in the water. He surfs mountains of water and is somewhat fearless about it and highly skilled and still alive to tell his story. I paired him up with Howard Fields, who is a neuroscientist from UCSF who studies pain and pleasure feedback loops, the dopamine system. So he's a very well-known neuroscientist and very well respected. And paired them up, put them on stage together with a microphone and said, Howard, can you explain to Jeff something about what's going on inside of him when he is pulled to the water? Why does he insist on going out and out and out into these big waves that nobody else has the guts to surf, ever since he was very little? And so to listen to them converse, Howard becoming more interested in the neuroscience of surfing, if you will, or surf addiction, it's probably a better description for Jeff at least, and Jeff becoming more interested in his own brain and what really is going on behind the scenes. And so each year we would bring together neuroscientists and, probably not the best term for them, but non-neuroscientists, and psychologists and non-psychologists, and pair them up, sometimes in groups of 3, and pose these questions. So 4 years of that. This past year, a guy named Paul Piff from UC Berkeley, who studies the science of awe. Now there's a cool job description. What do? I study the science of awe. Well, what do you mean? Well, I hang out with people who are feeling that feeling of awe and wonder, and I try to figure out what's happening physiologically to create that feeling. That's his job. We paired him up with a musician named Alexei Murdoch, whose music is inspired by natural awe and wonder. And if you listen to his music, he has a song called Orange Sky and another song called Blue Mind, about really that's created out of that relationship that he has with wild nature. Paired them up and let them go at this conversation about the science of awe and the practice of awe, and how Alexei, through his music, makes awe portable, which is an interesting way to think about art and music. So when you listen to a song, it takes you to that place, perhaps. If you look at a painting, if you look at a photograph, it takes you to that original place. It makes awe portable. So that was another chapter of the Blue Mind conversation. But I'm going to read a little bit, since this is a book reading. But before that, so speaking of awe, I know I'm supposed to talk about my book, but I love talking about the other books that I'm reading, or the books that I'm reading at the moment. So here's a book by James Nestor. It's called Deep. And James is a journalist and a writer, writes for Outside Magazine and The New Yorker and Atlantic Monthly and others. And he decided that he would just go in search of these incredible freedivers and spend time with them, and then learn to freedive himself and push his own limits and go further underwater and work on his breath hold and start to investigate the physiology of freediving. And what emerged is this kind of wild story of traveling around the world with people who are addicted to freediving on some levels, but also people who use freediving to study wild animals, who freedive with sperm whales in order to get closer to them in ways that you can't if you're breathing through a noisy apparatus. And what he discovered wasn't so much the desire to go deeper and further and longer, but the desire to find that place inside himself where he was deep enough for long enough and had this blue mind feeling, where he felt completely disconnected from our material, busy, sort of online world, and could just get away and hit that big blue reset button. So his is a blue mind journey, though he doesn't quite name it that. That occurs deep underwater, holding one's breath. And then Philip wrote this book, Philip Hoare, Hoare, British guy, great writer, wrote this book called The Sea Inside, and he explores the world, the ocean, on the surface mostly, and describes different kinds of interactions with the natural oceanic world. And I grabbed this book, not only because I really like it, but he wrote a review of Blue Mind in The Guardian that was rather glib and very British. And I say that in a loving way, perhaps. As a guy who loves to swim, he calls himself a wild swimmer, swims year-round off the coast of the UK. He loves whales. His Twitter handle is Philip Whale. He's a brilliant writer, but in his review, he tries so hard to deny his emotional connection to the water. Throughout the review, you just feel him in his Britishness resisting the emotional connection to water and the poetry of it, and for lack of a better word, the spiritual feeling, and just trying so hard. And then finally, at the end of a 500-word mini review, he sort of relents and gives in and says, well, that guy from California just may be on to something. And I just thought that was just a classic and wonderful, skeptical, resistant, but ultimately acquiescing to this idea that this is who we are. I mean, we are, in fact, water beings, and that sounds so cliche and corny and woo-woo and metaphysical, and I'm coming at it not from that point of view, coming at it from a point of view of an evolutionary biologist, and bringing that conversation a little bit further forward. Tim Beatley, who's the head of urban planning at the University of Virginia, has written a book called Blue Urbanism that just came out. And so, very serious academic guy, head of a department. He's an architect and a planner and a director of a whole department at UVA. And he writes about how to build cities and how to create buildings that are more compatible with water, more compatible with living on the coast, living by rivers, living by lakes, and how to bring those feelings and those activities inside, and how to make sure the people in those buildings, in those communities are maximizing the cognitive, emotional, and social capital that's at our doorsteps when we live along waterways. And I think here in Seattle, greater Seattle area, the lakes, I swam in your lake this afternoon right before I came over here. The ocean, the sound, we're surrounded by waters that are world class. And then certain times of the year, we're surrounded by waters from above that fall on our heads, and those can be appreciated as well. So I want to give you a little idea of where the practice of Blue Mind can go. There's a guy named Van Caraza who's a former pro surfer, former drug addict who turned his career in surfing and his recovery, or his in-process recovery, into a way to help people. And what Van does is he and his team take veterans who have various kinds of injuries and post-traumatic stress, takes them out, and they go surfing. And in some cases, it's quite a good therapy. So there's a passage right here that I want to share. So I had my own accident. I was driving a tractor at our little farm back in California, clearing a trail, hit a log, and the tractor rolled, as they tend to do. But in this case, it rolled off a 30-foot cliff and landed in a creek at the bottom of the cliff. And I was intact, but pretty banged up. My head, my body. The tractor was completely totaled. So there we are in the bottom of the cliff in the creek. And went to the hospital and did all the right things. But this connects to Van's work. So the doctor diagnosed post-traumatic stress. All I knew was that my brain and body were both a mess. I was an all-around lifelong athlete with excellent balance and coordination, yet now I couldn't walk down steep stairs or descend an escalator without the feeling of rolling off a cliff. I'd been an impeccable speller, but now I was making mistakes on the simplest words. The months since the accident were marked by slow recovery aided by water. I took long soaks in the bathtub with tons of Epsom salts at first. Then later I could get into the hot tub. My girls beside me to lift my spirits. I hobbled around on crutches for a month and a cane for a couple months after that. I went swimming, bobbing, in the cold Pacific. Therapy for both my banged up body and mind. One day I walked back to the place where the tractor and I had landed. Standing in the icy waters of Mill Creek at the base of the cliff also helped to heal the mental trauma. Soon after the accident, I embedded myself with Van Carraz's team at Operation Surf. It didn't take long before I was in the water side by side with guys like Martin Pollock, who had lost limbs in the Middle East. And so Martin is a British veteran. He has one arm and no legs, has a prosthetic arm, and then we call them his stubbies that he can put on to walk around. And prior to joining the Operation Surf team, his plan, as he describes it, was to hang out in pubs at home and drink with his buddies, with his mates, and literally become a blob, as he puts it, a blob with one arm. That was sort of his vision for himself. And then he got hooked up with Operation Surf. It didn't take long before I was in the water, side by side with guys like Martin Pollock, who had lost his limbs in the Middle East. Of course, I had all my limbs, a clear advantage in the water, but a malfunctioning, rattled brain doesn't care what did the rattling. Tractor, IED, car crash, falling off a cliff, or down a flight of stairs. The guys accepted me into their motley band of surfers, but each morning out on the waves, I felt frustrated and weak. My balance was shot, and forward motion brought up that vertiginous feeling of rolling, falling, crashing, and a need to grab a rail. But still, we were all there in the water, having fun, cheering each other on. Then, Van said, "This one's yours, Jay. Don't think, no mind, eyes on the beach." I paddled hard, hopped up, and rode it. And Van gave me a little push, so that helped a little bit. No thoughts, no rolling, no falling. That wave felt like a never-ending exhale, the opposite of a micro moment, a time warp, jazz, a painless birth, summer in my soul, catharsis, a lifetime somehow packed into a now. I looked over my shoulder and there was Martin, surfing the same wave, all the way to the beach. Blue-minded and fully stoked, we smiled at each other and paddled back out. The bath, when I got home, was pretty nice too. So that, a personal experience interacting with a group of people who found something different by being in the water. And there are many stories about people who have been part of Operation Surf and groups and organizations like Operation Surf. There's an organization called Heroes on the Water that takes men and women with post-traumatic stress out kayak fishing. And if has anybody ever been kayak fishing? You may know that kayak is one small part of it, and fishing is one small part of it. Most of the time spent kayak fishing is spent sitting quietly in a boat on the water, essentially meditating, if you will. But Heroes on the Water doesn't refer to what they do as meditation, because that might remove some of the people who may appreciate that work. Because they might say, I don't meditate, I don't want to meditate, I want to kayak fish. But being out on the water is an incredibly calming experience. So I'm going to read a couple bits more. Here's just a quote, and getting into a little bit of the explanation of what is going on. So there are lots of anecdotes, lots of personal feelings, lots of poetry. But what is going on when we step away from our indoor environment out to the water? What's going on in our brains? What's the story? And I would go into the stacks in the library and the bookstores and go through the various books about the brain, and there are many, and you've probably noticed. Your brain on music, your brain on technology, your brain on happiness, certainly your brain on stress. There's even books about your brain on chocolate, your brain on red wine. There's studies in literature about your brain on red wine. You can kind of find your brain on fill in the blank, just about everything. Your brain on magic. There's a whole book on how magicians fool you by knowing a little bit better how your brain works than you do. And certainly marketing. So the attempt to marry neuroscience and marketing, giving marketers an insight into human purchasing decisions. But I never found any references to water in all of those books. And then in all the books about water and the ocean, no reference to the human brain, to neuroscience, to psychology, to the mind. I thought that was a bit of a miss, a bit of a gap that could be closed. But there was this one guy, and his name's Oliver Sacks, and he's written a few books about the brain over the years, and is quite beloved in terms of brain researchers, and he's written some popular books. And he said, there's something about being in water and swimming which alters my mood, gets my thoughts going, as nothing else can. So here's a guy who studies the brain, who writes about it quite famously, saying that being in the water gets his brain going like nothing else can. And he's tried a lot of things, if you're familiar with Oliver Sacks, from some legal, some illegal, some dangerous, and some a little bit edgy. Theories and stories would construct themselves in my mind as I swam to and fro, or round and around Lake Jeff. Sentences and paragraphs would write themselves in my mind, and at such times I would have to come to shore every so often to discharge them. So Oliver, Dr. Sacks, would keep a waterproof notebook, still does, on shore, on the dock, or on the side of the pool, as the case may be, as he swims in lakes, the Long Island Sound, and swims laps in pools, so that when he has these ideas that then become his theories and his books and his research, he'd have a place to jot them down and later transcribe them. So what's going on? What do we think's going on? Well, there are more questions than answers, but the basic story is that when we get away from voices, So you're not listening to me, you're not processing language. When we get away from visual distractions, when we get away from background music and the multitasking we attempt to do day in and day out, when we get away from our smartphones and our laptops and our desktops and quiet our minds, they change, they shift. One of the best places to do that is just taking a walk outside. Right? There's a quality of thinking, a quality of conversation that can occur when you just step outside of the four walls, out through the door, and take a walk in the green space. And green space has been studied somewhat. But what the researchers who study green space in the brain have found is that when you add some blue to the green space, when you add a water element to that nature experience, it does what it does even better. And what happens is you move from what's referred to as the active mode network to the default mode network, a different set of brain regions that are good for different activities. So focused, intense, number crunching. There's a time and a place for some urgency and some fear and what I would call red mind to get you through a problem, to get you out of trouble. And then there's a time and a place for what I refer to as blue mind, which is that default mode network. So where your cortisol level doesn't go up, it goes down. When your breathing goes down, your heart rate goes down. It's a different feeling, right? That's what people are paying for when they're paying a 40, 50, sometimes 100% premium for that house on the lake. And I drove by a few of them today. The houses on the lake are worth a lot more than the ones just across the street that don't have that unobstructed view. People buying those houses are pretty smart, pretty successful, and have an extra $1 million in their pocket to pay a premium. And I assume they're not just throwing that money away, that they think they're getting some value for that extra money, for that water view. And what that value has to do with relaxation, letting that stress go, reducing your cortisol levels, and having your heart rate, your breathing rate drop. So being able to wake up with that available is important for some people. Right? So that whole dynamic is what we call blue mind. Now I bring Paul Piff back, who studies the science of awe. And what he's finding is that true awe responses, true feelings of wonder, lead people to be more altruistic, more compassionate, more connected to those around them. So his research is showing that when you feel awe, you move from this me to we, as they say. You have a sense of oneness. And you can see how this conversation quickly can sound very touchy-feely, very Santa Cruz-y, as I've been told. I do live near Santa Cruz. I was born in Manhattan, and I consider myself a North American. But it has that sense of being fuzzy, right? But as you begin to dig in and connect the dots and talk to the scientists who are just beginning to understand what's going on with our brains, you understand that there's something more behind this connection to water. All right, so I want to switch over and have some time for questions, but I want to read one last little bit. And it's, I guess, a bit of the inspirational piece of the ending of the book, and explains a little bit of why I wanted to give you a blue marble as well. But in a perfect world, our waters run healthy, clean, and free. Their waves and their currents and their stillness welcome all of us to heal, to play, create, and love abundantly. For many of us, until that moment of observance or submergence, we work hard and struggle to maintain our ancient personal connection to water. There's an interdependency with the natural world that goes beyond ecosystems biodiversity, or economic benefits. Our neurons and water need each other to live. So all I really want to say is this. Get in the water. Walk along the water, move across its surface, get under it, sit in it, leap into it, listen to it, touch the water. Close your eyes and drink a big glass. Fall more deeply in love with water in all its shapes, colors, and forms. Let it heal you and make you a better, stronger version of yourself. You need water, and water needs you now. I wish you water. Thanks. Those blue marbles are meant as gifts to you, and all we ask is that you hold on to them, and then at some point, whenever that may be, could be tomorrow, it could be in 10 years, that you give them away to someone who's doing something good, and with whatever message you want to attach to it, and then ask them to do the same thing. And there are now 1 million of them traveling from person to person without force. They're given away freely. There's no agenda other than saying thanks, and hopefully supporting works to make our planet a little bit healthier. But James Cameron took his to the bottom of the ocean when he built his submarine, famously, and dove with it. The Dalai Lama got one, the Pope got one, so we're ecumenical, try to keep things even. Jane Goodall got one, lots of kids have gotten them and shared them. And I call it a killer app because it's socio-physical media. So it requires no device. If your power's out, your battery's dead, it still works. You can still pass it on, and they just keep going. So just a simple reminder that we live on this little blue marble we call home, and if we don't take care of it and we don't thank those who do, we're heading in a pretty bad direction. So, but we do have some time for some questions. And
I was kind of curious about what the 4 years you've been doing the combinations of neurobiologists and others, if there's been any brain scans involved in that showing real differences between on and off water.
Yeah, so there's a range of so questions about, say, fMRI, brain scans, or EEG work, and so there's a range of studies. Some of them are mobile EEG work. So as you move out of the laboratory, things get a little bit fuzzier because you lose control. Right? So you get somebody walking around through a city with mobile EEG headset on. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of influence. They're bringing a lot of baggage. So the data is messy. They're moving, so your EEG is going to be picking up muscle movement. So you need to do a lot of filtering. So there's some research of people moving through green space, through urban space, and then green space with blue added. And like I said, that work suggests that green space is good for a certain kind of thinking, but adding some blue to the green space is even better. You can tell a story, and this is what evolutionary biologists do. They tell stories about the past because nobody was around 4 million years ago to actually say this is true. But Ardipithecus remains are found at the edge of a river. So you can kind of imagine the earliest remains in the UK and Europe are found at the edge of an estuary. So early humans, they would be cruising around saying, okay, where are we going to put home? Well, water is important. Water brings food, it brings hydration. And looking at that water would probably feel on some level good. I'll use the word beauty, although they obviously did not use that word in describing the water. But it would feel beautiful. It would feel like home. So they would put their camp, their settlement, their lives within proximity, perhaps visually, auditorily, within proximity of water. That makes sense, right? So now we fast forward, Well, we still have retained those signals. We didn't have, early humans didn't have GIS. They didn't have any way to really have maps, but they had that feeling of where to position themselves. And so now we carry that feeling forward. And if you look at the psychology research, you find that humans across cultures describe images similarly in terms of what they consider beautiful. So a certain amount of vegetation and a certain amount of water mixed together is considered somewhat universally a beautiful scene. High enough vantage point to be safe, but also in proximity of water and greenness. There's some research that I'll say a little bit about, but I can't say too much because it's in peer review. But it's sort of like a watch this space message. University of Exeter Medical School is doing probably the best blue mind research. They've an interdisciplinary team of quantitative geographers, psychologists, sociologists, toxicologists, human health experts, medical doctors, and neuroscientists working on this blue mind set of questions. And they've done some fMRI research and are reanalyzing the data. And that's going to come out shortly, but it provides some nice and intriguing support for these ideas. And it opens up a whole bunch more research. So my goal with this book has been and has been successful in some ways, has been to sort of prod some young scientists who are interested in water, interested in conservation, interested in human behavior, and perhaps studied neuroscience as undergrads, to connect some of those things and look at, that question that we started out in the beginning, is being in nature, being by water, just like bowling? Or is it different in some way? Is there something about being near moving wild water that changes the way our brains work? And I think that's one of the most fascinating set of questions around. Yeah.
So a common experience that divers have, which I would love a scientific explanation for, is sometimes you're just down underwater, scuba diving or with a snorkel, and you see a picture, and it's just like this split image, but it's burned into your brain. Like a picture you've studied for hours and hours. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's probably happened to me 50 times, and many divers I talk to have the same experience. What's the science behind that?
Well, I'm going to take a guess at that, but I think part of it has to do with the change in the sensory stimulation that you have. So it's sort of like, has anybody ever gotten into one of those sensory deprivation tanks? You have? Anybody else? Kind of interesting.
Comeback here, by the way.
But they are making a comeback. And they sound pretty far out and pretty, 70s, I guess you might say. But it's just you turning off visual stimulation, auditory stimulation, matching your body temperature with the water temperature and the air temperature, and floating. So gravity kind of goes away. You're not bumping into things. You don't have any clothes on. You're not seeing anything. So you're turning off what you've become accustomed to for your whole life, of this constant busy feed of information that's coming into your brain. And now your brain's sitting there in the dark, wants to go to work on something, and so it goes to work on your own stuff, and it can be a pretty trippy experience. Just standing on the beach, going for a walk on the beach and standing there by yourself and paying attention to the sound of the waves and looking at the horizon is a step towards that sort of sensory deprivation flotation tank experience. Diving can be a step towards that. So you have more capacity to create a clear memory. And so I think that is some part of what's going on, is that you're underwater, things are somewhat simplified, and your attention is, and then also your mask, so your range of view is limited and focused. and outlined and framed. And now you have this brain capacity to really focus and create a deep snapshot memory, visual memory of an animal.
Like you're on a 2-hour dive. It doesn't do it for the whole thing. It
Right.
might be every 30 dives you get
Yep.
that one.
Yeah.
Nothing special.
Well, you know, when I dive, dives vary in terms of the challenges, the technical distractions, the number of people that you may be with. If it's a scientific dive, there's some busy work to do. You may have a dive slate, you may have a computer, things to do and stuff going on. Sharks, other distractions. So those can keep you busy, and perhaps contribute to that that happening. But so that's I think getting an fMRI on a dive boat, or getting some of these mobile EEG technologies out with divers, and at the very easy end of things, the basic physiology, spitting in a tube and measuring cortisol levels in different scenarios would be an interesting research project to work on with the dive community. A good question. Yeah.
Besides writing the book, it seems that you have founded some institutes or organizations.
Yep.
Can you tell us what those are and what the purpose of them are?
Yeah, I've helped start several nonprofits, and most of them are related to the ocean. Many related to protecting endangered species, particularly sea turtles. One project we started is called seeturtles.org, and essentially it's about finding people who want to see a turtle, want to go on a vacation with their family or with their friends, and find a location where they can see a sea turtle, be with it on the beach, be with it in the water, and have their vacation benefit conservation. And so it's a portal that connects people, travelers, with those opportunities, and sometimes very small towns, coastal communities, where turtle hunters are looking for alternative incomes. So that's one of the projects. And I'm on a lot of different advisory boards and work with several nonprofits that work on coastal protection and fixing fisheries, reducing bycatch, helping fishermen get cleaner technologies and get a better price for their seafood. Yeah, so lots of different projects going on. Cool. Yeah. Yes.
I have an online question from Jocelyn. She says, have you met people who don't particularly like water and believe they don't have any attraction or special feelings about water? What do you think about it?
Yeah, very few people will say, I hate the ocean. I don't like to look at water. I don't like to be anywhere near it. A bigger group of people will say, I don't like to swim. I don't like to put my face underwater, and that includes my mom. She doesn't like to swim in the ocean. She doesn't like to swim in a pool. She had some experiences as a kid. Some boys were not particularly kind, bad time in the water, so she associates swimming with that experience. She went on her honeymoon with my dad, and while they were in the ocean, which took a lot for her to get in the ocean, he stuck a baby octopus down the back of her swimsuit, and it freaked her out. She doesn't want to go back in the ocean. Not cool. And apparently, Miss Hawaii was somewhere involved in this whole thing, which made it even worse. And he's still trying to live that down. But we went on their 50th anniversary back to Hawaii, and my daughters and I convinced my mom to put on her swimsuit, go with us to the ocean, get in the water, and let us hold her as she floated. And my whole life, I've never seen her that relaxed. And now she's interested in getting back in the water. So that's the point being, we have a biological affinity for water. Obviously, we need it to survive. We have this attraction to those blue open horizon spaces that help us relax, perhaps feel more creative. But we also have our culture and our experiences. And you combine all of that and you get us. And we're complex. Each of us has a bunch of different things going on. So you can't just say everybody feels the same way about the ocean or about swimming or about being in the dark in a flotation tank. Some people, that sounds like the most nightmarish scenario would be to be in a coffin-like tank with the lights out and the door closed. So there's a lot of variation. And as you try to study this idea of brain on water, you have to control for all of those different factors and choose what you want to study. So the problem there is, how do you take the awesomeness of the ocean and bring it into a lab inside, an fMRI machine? I mean, how do you even begin to do that without drastically changing the experience? That's part of the challenge, and you can't scan somebody's brain in the field. There are some technologies, but as I mentioned, they're somewhat limited. So you can show people images, maybe 3D, starting. This is an interesting group to talk to about the technology, but you can start to create a virtual ocean experience inside a laboratory while somebody is in an fMRI, having in surround sound, a 3D ocean experience, and look at how they respond. And some folks at Stanford are beginning to do that with virtual natural environments down in the basement at Stanford Medical School, and simulating those kinds of situations and seeing how people's brains respond. Yeah.
Are there differences in responses to salt water versus fresh water?
Yeah. So from a visual point of view, it's similar. It's the differences seem to be about the horizon and the feeling of of open space. If it's a smaller body of water and you're looking across a lake, those tend to be the freshwater bodies of water or a river. So in terms of aesthetic appeal, there's variation. Some people get a little nervous when the body of water is enormous and the perspective is low, so they feel like they're potentially vulnerable to waves or an image that doesn't reference land at all. So you show somebody an open ocean image, and if it's an immersive enough image or piece of artwork, some people find that unattractive. It feels a little scary. It reminds them of being at sea, which they may not like. And if you can reference the land in that image, then they feel like, okay, here's the land right here, even if it's just part of the painting or the photograph or the film, and they have that sense. So that's not so much a freshwater, saltwater experience, but then upon immersion, it's a different experience. Your buoyancy, the feel of the water on your skin is different, and there's different levels of appeal of that. So some people really enjoy the buoyancy, and that's an attractive thing about being in the ocean, being in a very salty sea, or the extreme being the 850 pounds of salt put into a very small tank that you climb into and close the hatch. Sort of the people who use those tanks don't even call that water. They call it salt, liquid salt, rather than water with some salt in it. It's more that hyper supersaturated saline solution. Yeah. But you can kind of sense that this project has kind of kicked the door open. We're standing in the doorway, and there's this array of fascinating, somewhat esoteric and also practical questions related to healthcare, related to education, related to each of our well-being, and obviously related to the environment, related to real estate, related to the travel industry, related to creativity, and more questions than answers, for sure.
I want to take time for book signings.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.